All right, good morning, everyone. This is Chris with Beyond Pay, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. As we've mentioned before, at Beyond Pay, we are guided here by three simple principles, and they are to learn, collaborate, and care. And that's one of the reasons why we put on these webinars for our customers and for our friends, and sometimes even for some of our competitors. So let me start by saying thank you for being a customer. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We care about you. We care about your day. We care about your reputation, and we care about your success. So thanks. As many of you also know, Beyond Pay does more than just payroll. We work with hundreds of companies to help with various areas of their HR. Our goal is to find the perfect mix of technology and service to complement your HR team. We want you to actually use your HR technology. So we've developed a new offering to help you get there. We call it Managed HR, and we believe it can supercharge your HR team and your company. If you're interested in finding out more, reach out to me or anyone else on the Beyond Pay team, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it. Today's webinar focuses on recruiting, and more specifically, behavior-based interviewing. Jason Zahn, our Director of HR Services, will take you through a framework to get more out of your interviews. I know for me, interviewing has always been a challenge. It's time-consuming, and I always wonder if I'm really accomplishing anything. So I hope to learn something today along with you. Oh, and just a reminder, as we move through, you can post questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. Jason, they're all yours.
Thank you, Chris. So today we're going to be talking about behavior-based interviews, and along with what Chris just said about learning, collaborating, and caring, we want to pass this information along to you to help you during your interview process. Behavior-based interviewing has been around for a while. It may be a new concept to you, but we feel it is a best practice and certainly one that we do use at Beyond Pay. Behavioral interviewing is a proven hiring technique that will allow you to hire individuals who have the necessary experience for the position within a legally defensible structure. And this technique has a higher likelihood than other more traditional interviewing techniques for predicting the future performance of job candidates. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about the behavioral interviewing overview, job analysis and critical incidents. We're going to be looking at behavioral interview questions and how we establish those. We're going to be looking at rating guides, then conducting a behavioral interview, and then making a hiring decision. So at the close of today, we're going to be able to explain behavioral interviewing and your role in the process, how to conduct a job analysis using the critical incident technique. We're going to be able to develop or update a job description using your job analysis findings, develop rating expectations for the open position, develop legally defensible lead and probing interview questions, implement best practices for conducting behavioral interviews, and then making hiring decisions based on the results of those interviews. So what is behavioral interviewing? Behavioral interviewing is an interviewing technique that focuses on a candidate's past experiences, behaviors, knowledge, skills, and abilities by asking the candidate to provide specific examples of when he or she has demonstrated certain behaviors or skills. Answers to behavioral interview questions should provide verifiable, concrete evidence as to how a candidate has dealt with issues in the past. And this information often reveals a candidate's level of experience and his or her potential to handle similar situations in your organization. The premise behind behavioral interviewing is that its most accurate predictor of future performance is past performance in similar situations. And this can only happen if the main interview questions are delivered to every job candidate with the same wording in the same order using the same scoring system. And that's really the premise of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's look at interviewing techniques. First, we're going to talk about traditional interviews, which in my opinion, I think probably 90% of our customers use today. So they have a loose framework, they have discretionary content, they have more of a conversational flow. Candidates, different candidates may be asked different questions. There is no rating scale. It's more or less this manager says, yes, I want them, and this manager says maybe, and the other manager says, no, I don't want them. So there's no rating scale used. Interviewers do not need to agree on acceptable answers, and honestly, it's susceptible to legal challenges. Some of the pros of traditional interviews, you may get a better sense of the candidate's personality due to it being a less formal process. The interviewing can rephrase questions if the candidate is not responding appropriately to the language of the interview question. So those are some of the pros of the typical interviews. Some of the cons, it may be less reliable as the interviewer may ask different questions to each candidate. The applicant appearance, including their attractiveness and attire, may bias the interviewer. And then nonverbal cues such as eye contact, smiling, etc., may bias interview ratings. So the behavior.
Jason, can I interject a question? So for traditional interviews, I'm sure you didn't just make all of this up. Is there a research that shows that gut feelings aren't really serving us well in the traditional interview process?
I don't have examples of the research, but yes, there are certainly examples of hiring managers making decisions on a first appearance as opposed to can they actually do the job?
Sure.
And that happens quite often. It's a very good question. So if we look at the behavioral interviewing technique, all candidates are asked the same question, same order, just like we talked about. They're evaluated on the same rating scale, and interviewers are in agreement on acceptable answers. And there's more consistency, which is going to reduce your legal challenges. So if you look at the pros of the behavioral interview questions, the questions are based on the job analysis. Each candidate is asked the same questions, and they're based on the scale, and it provides interviews with real life examples of how candidates have performed in the past and will likely perform in the future. Now, there are some cons. So the questions must be designed with specific behaviors in mind, making for potentially more work on the part of the recruiter. So yes, it does take more time up front, but you're going to be assured that you're going to be getting a better candidate for the position. It does require training on everyone who's going to be in the interview process, especially on the questions that are being asked and the rating scale. And it requires close active listening and control on the part of the interviewer. If you ever heard that in an interview, there should be the interviewer should talk 20% of the time, that's actually exactly what this process is designed to do. You're going to be having the candidate talk 80% of the time. So behavioral interviewing is proven to improve your hiring accuracy within the organization. And by using this technique, we should be able to avoid financial and non-financial costs associated with turnover, mishires, and mismatches. So your role in the behavioral interviewing process. So this is kind of, the steps involved in, I'll say the recruiting process, although this really gets into once you start getting candidates in. So, obviously first you're going to define the organizational strategy. Which positions do you need to fill? Once you determine that, then you conduct a job analysis. You're going to define the competencies. You want to know, the qualifications that are required, the experience that's required. Once you have that, we're going to talk about developing the behavioral questions and creating the user guide. We're going to talk about training the interviewers, preparing and conducting interviews, and then reviewing the information collected and finally making a hiring decision. So behavioral interviewing is more structured style of interviewing that focuses on experience, behavior, knowledge, skills, and abilities that are job related. In its most formal format, behavioral interviews involve an extremely structured process in order to get more accurate hiring outcome. The behavioral interviewing technique can take a great deal of effort and planning before the interview. And some of that effort and planning must come from the hiring manager who is looking to fill the position. So let's look at a job analysis and critical incidents. So a job analysis is a systematic study of jobs to determine what activities and responsibilities they include, the qualifications, the conditions under which the work is performed, and the reporting structure of the jobs. So this is really the first role that the hiring manager would play in the behavioral interviewing process. The job analysis is the process of gathering, examining, interpreting data about the job, tasks, and responsibilities. The job analysis will help you define the critical duties and functions of a position. This information can help you create and update position descriptions and can also provide a source of legally defensible assessment of the selection procedures. So looking at a critical incident, this is a crucial activity or task that has special significance to the role. It may either make a positive or negative contribution to the job or role, may help to distinguish satisfactory performance from unsatisfactory performance, considered the deal breakers for a job, and are typically identified through the interviews with the hiring manager or role incumbents. So a job analysis, if we look at the summary of this, a job analysis generally involves gathering information about an employee's duties, the employee's performance of those duties, the job in relation to other jobs in the same department and grade or job family, the conditions under which the work is performed, and the reporting structure for the role. The results of the job analysis will typically include a thorough understanding of the essential functions of the job, a list of all job duties and responsibilities, a percentage of time spent for each group of tasks, the job's relative importance in comparison with other jobs, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and characteristics needed to perform the job. So the hiring manager interviews job candidates to investigate job-related events, incidents, processes, or issues, discuss how these events were handled, and explore the outcomes of these events. And then each setting should be shared as a story and should include a setting, a behavior, and a result. So in a job analysis and critical incidents, some of the questions that you are going to be asking is what happened, what led up to the event, where did it take place, who was involved, what was the outcome? What did you do to influence the outcome? What did others do to influence the outcome? What did you learn from the experience or decision, and what might you do differently in the future? Some of the critical incidents might include aspects of the work that went extremely well, aspects of the work that were extremely difficult or problematic, activities in the work that were particularly demanding, incidents that were conflict or criticism, and typically relate to issues of communication, knowledge, culture, or relationship.
So Jason, a simple example would be asking a candidate, did they ever have a customer accuse them of being rude? And what did they do about that?
Yeah, that would be a good one. And that's a very good point. We're going to get into how to develop these questions, but that is kind of
That's kind of where we're
beginning
going. That's the
stage.
idea.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
Okay. Just want to make
Yes.
sure I was.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, and obviously we're going to get into this, but how did you handle a rude customer and what was the result? So kind of you're trying to find out what did they learn from that situation. Yep. So looking at a sample job description, this is just obviously the top of a job description, but really this is the focus of the behavioral interview. If you look at this, usually what you would see at the bottom is, experience required, education required, and kind of essential job duties. But this is really the focus, the summary, and the essential functions where the behavioral interviewing process will come into play. Okay, so Developing your questions. So your lead questions are going to be open-ended. They're going to use introductory statements like tell me about a time, provide a recent example, describe an occasion, walk me through, and they should always elicit a story from the candidate. So as we discussed, behavioral interviews are developed using primarily behavior questions that are intended to provide insights into how a candidate has performed in the past and should focus on task behaviors and cultural fit. To gain these insights, the questions for behavioral interviews should be written to elicit details about a candidate's past experience that will reflect the identified job-related competencies. And then these questions should be clear and concise and should encourage candidates to share openly about their typical behaviors that demonstrate the job-related competencies in question. So the lead questions are based on competencies identified during the job analysis and should only address skills that are required upon the start of the role, not skills that are learned on the job. And they should also make use of clear language and avoid acronyms and organizational role-related jargon so as to ensure that all candidates can understand the questions being asked of them. The same group of lead questions are asked in the same order to each candidate. And all of these facets help to ensure that candidates are being treated equally and fairly and attempts to minimize and influence the interview's biases. So probing questions, these are questions that are allowing interviews to dig deeper into candidates' responses based on verbal or nonverbal cues. They're based on triggers that are prompted through the candidate's responses to lead questions, are based heavily on an interviewer's use of active listening and observation as a candidate relates facts and experiences about how they behaved in the past. And typically a behavior question will trigger 3 to 4 probing questions based on the candidate's initial response. So these are just some examples of when to use your probing questions. So initial answers are vague or do not fully address the lead question. The candidate's tone changes drastically, and the candidate seems to have difficulty forming an answer. So where to focus? Obviously, when you have a role, it's usually either a manager or a non-manager. So your questions are going to be different as far as the type of questions you're going to be asking. Individual contributors, you want to ask more questions about the role specifically, what in their past indicates that the candidate understands the role and has the required experience, and will the candidate interact with colleagues in a way that supports the existing teams. Supervisors, you're going to ask more organizational culture, leadership skills, and leadership potential questions, such as what inspires the candidate as a leader, what is the candidate's typical leadership style, does the leadership style match the organization, the culture of the organization, and does the candidate's ethical behavior match the expected of the organizational leaders? So your behavioral interview questions should focus on the job-related competencies, and they should also share focus with your organizational culture, the department or team culture. So obviously with any interview, you have to avoid legal trouble. And, as mentioned before, the behavioral interview process is one that is more legally defensible than your traditional interview process. So under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, there are a variety of state and federal laws where it's unlawful for employers with 15 or more employees to discriminate against job candidates on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and religion. So you want to make sure that you're ensuring that all lead behavioral questions are closely tied to results of the job analysis, meaning that they are job related, and ensuring that a standardized rating scale is used to assess the qualifications of all candidates. You want to make sure that you're asking the same questions to all job candidates and providing clear training to all employees who will be conducting interviews for your organization. So you want to avoid guiding language. As you are developing behavioral interview questions, it is important to ensure that all candidates are providing a truthful and accurate account of their past behavior. However, there has been some concern that some behavioral questions may lead candidates to share only success stories or the right answers and not give a full picture of their true behaviors. To eliminate some of the leading nature of these questions, it is important to consider the way that we develop our lead behavioral questions and train our interviews to ask probing questions. So these are some examples of guiding language. So tell me about a time when you successfully performed. Successfully is the word there. This type of activity or behavior doesn't bother you, does it? As an organization require this type of behavior, how do you feel about this type of behavior? So you can see how these are really leading the candidate into the right answer. So a best practice on the behavioral interviewing is using the STAR model. So the STAR model is situation, task, action, result. So situation would be, what was the situation the candidate was in? What was the task the candidate needed to accomplish? The action, what were the actions the candidate took to accomplish this task? And what were the results? So if we look at an example, so using the STAR model, tell me about a time. And then the task is where you were faced with multiple competing deadlines. The action is, how did you balance your workload? And the results, to meet all of the project goals. So taking all those and making one complete question would be, tell me about a time where you were faced with multiple competing deadlines. And then how did you balance your workload to meet all of the project goals? So that would be one question that you would ask to the job applicant, and then you would just elicit their response and let them talk about it. You would then, as you're listening, you're going to be developing your probing questions. So something that doesn't make sense to you, any red flags in there, did they answer the whole question? So these are things that you're going to be listening for so that you can develop your probing questions. All right, so looking at rating scales, when evaluating job candidates, it's important that all of your interviewers use a standardized rating scale that is easily understandable and well-defined. Typically, an organization will already have a rating scale defined for their interviews, but if not, it could be as simple as a 1 through 5 rating scale. So a rating scale could look like this. This is the 1 through 5 that I was talking about. So a 1 gives you far exceeds requirements, down to 5 where there's a significant gap. And you can kind of see, if they're getting a 1, it's a perfect answer. They demonstrated competency accurately, consistently, and independently. All points relevant, all good examples. Whereas 5 would be the significant gap where they failed to demonstrate competency regardless of guidance provided, or they gave no good examples. And one thing that I will say, I've been using this interviewing technique for quite some time, and job applicants are not always going to have a really good example. So I typically will allow them to use a non-work related example if they feel it's relevant to the task at hand. So if they're able to give a more of a personal as opposed to a professional example, I will let them give that, and obviously it would be taken into consideration on the rating scale, but at least it's something that they can give you, and you can use that information to give them a rating and ultimately make a decision. So rating guides are used to tie each level of your rating scale to behavioral examples and used by interviewers to support their use of the rating scale. So conducting interviews. So there's a lot of different ways that you can conduct interviews. So you can have a hiring manager only. So it's basically just one person interviewing and nobody else in the organization interviews. So that person independently observes, documents, and evaluates candidates, only one viewpoint, and there's potential for rater bias. You can have a panel interview. So a panel interview would be multiple interviewers interviewing a single candidate. It reduces the rate of bias with multiple viewpoints, and the final rating comes from discussion and consensus. And then multiple stakeholders. So you might have the hiring manager, you may have HR, you may have another hiring manager, all conducting separate interviews. The interviews are conducted in a serial fashion, and then you get multiple viewpoints. So those are the types of interviews. So conducting interviews, key interview behaviors, it's imperative to follow these behavioral best practices. Come with something to take notes with. Pretty self-explanatory. Best practice, do not take notes on the resume. You always use a separate sheet of paper. Look and act professional. Explain the interview process to candidates. So usually before the interview starts, explain the process. If they're going to be meeting with multiple people, you want to tell them they're going to be meeting with multiple people and at least give them an idea of how long they're going to be there. Practice legally defensible behaviors, meaning keep all the questions related to the job. Ask behavioral interviewing questions exactly as provided. So typically, if you see the serial where you have multiple interviewers, you don't want to have every interviewer ask the exact same questions. You want to develop your behavioral interview questions and have manager one ask a certain number of questions, manager two asks another set of questions, and manager three asks another set of questions. And then avoid leading questions when you probe for additional information. Use appropriate body language. Avoid nonverbal cues that could change a candidate's behavior or response. Use active listening skills. You want to treat all candidates the same, practice fairness and objectivity, and do not give the candidate any unfair or unrealistic expectations. So opening the interview. It's not a good idea to go right into the behavioral-based questions. It's always a good idea to, kind of open it up and ask some different type of questions before you get into the behavioral questions. So some examples here are, tell me a bit about your work background and give me a description of how you think it relates to our current opening.
Jason, it
Yeah.
seems to me that you're recommending that this be very controlled really from start to finish. I think a lot of us fall into the trap of trying to be personable and sociable in these situations, and maybe have a lot of small talk leading
Yep.
up to or being in. And are you kind of strictly advising against that?
No, I think the small talk can certainly be done up front, but when you at some point you do need to move into the behavioral based questions, and I think that is part of the traditional interview process where you start with the small talk and then you get into work experience, but you really never get into the behavioral interviewing and really
Right.
finding out if that candidate is going to be a good fit.
Mhm.
So, when I look at those two different interview types, I think the small talk is fine for both, but with the behavioral based interviewing, you're going to move on to a set of questions.
Sure. And I would think small talk might be a dangerous way to probably get into some
It
personal
could.
areas that are so depending on the experience of the interviewer, how
It,
need to be cautious there.
it could. It's a very good point. And, my small talk is typically, how's your drive? Did it take longer than you anticipated? Things like that. So you want
Right.
to keep it focused on the job itself. Obviously you don't want to talk about, family at all. If they bring up family, you kind of just listen and you don't say anything about anything else about it.
Mm. Right.
So again, opening the interview, you can have them tell you about their last job, ask them to tell you about the opportunity, why they're interested in it, what they like most about their profession, short and long-term goals, and what are 3 things that are most important to you. So those are some ideas for opening the interview. After you get that information, then it's my recommendation is to move right into the behavioral-based interviewing. So using active listening ensures that the listener is focused and helps to avoid misunderstandings between the communicators. This is key to the behavioral interviewing process. So here are some tips for the active listening. Always maintain eye contact, lean forward to indicate interest, nod to demonstrate understanding. You want to try to mirror facial expressions to demonstrate empathy or sympathy, and allow the speaker to complete his or her thoughts completely. Obviously you don't want to interrupt them. Remain as neutral as possible, and repeat and summarize information to clarify and ensure understanding. So if they say something that you may not understand completely, you might want to just repeat it and make sure that they acknowledge that you heard it the way that they wanted you to hear it. So taking notes. Note taking is key to an interview's ability uh, to revisiting and remembering the responses of the employment candidate. However, too much note taking may unnerve a candidate or could distract them from the ability to connect with the candidate on a personal level. So what do? You can use shorthand or key phrases to summarize the content. Make sure you balance your note taking and your eye contact. Avoid judgment in your notes. Obviously, those notes are discoverable if there is a lawsuit. So avoid judgment. Avoid rating a candidate's response before they have left the interview. Rate the candidate's response as soon as possible, just so you have it's fresher in your mind, and ensure that your notes support or justify your ratings. So closing the interview, obviously, just like your opening, you don't want to just end with a behavioral-based question. You want to, kind of ease them out of the interview, if you will. So you want to ask the candidate if they're interested in any job-based information, ask about their availability, ask for a list of people who can be contacted for references, explain the time frame on the hiring process, explain how to get in touch with the interviewer and when to expect to hear from him or her, and then walk the candidate to the door or to the next interview room and thank them for the interview. So all interviewers need to have the same candidate expectations, evaluate the candidate in the same way, and agree upon their evaluations when you're making a selection process. Keep in mind that interviewees are all coming into the interview process with different perspectives, biases, and beliefs about the role and the job candidates. There's always a chance that this bias will show up in a candidate's ratings for the open position. So to maintain fairness when evaluating a candidate, it is critical that all interviewers have the same candidate expectations, that the interviewers all evaluate each candidate in a similar way. So debriefing meeting. So obviously, if there's a one-on-one meeting, it's just one person making the decision. There's no debriefing meeting. It's pretty much that person's decision. But if there's multiple people, you want to have a debrief meeting to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So who should attend? All interviewers, hiring managers. When should it take place? Pretty much immediately after the interview. That's where you're going to have the best information about that job applicant. What should the discussion include? First impression vote, review of questions and responses, and final voting. So, it is recommended to use a first impression, but you should also be using the review of the questions and responses. So the following should be provided to and maintained by HR with the following hiring decision. So the job analysis and data for outcomes, job description, behavioral interview questions, rating scale, rating guide, any interview notes, and candidate evaluations for the interview. So if there are multiple people interviewing, all of those notes and all of that information should be kept in one file. So you shouldn't have a hiring manager and HR with different files. It should all be in one file. So that is the behavioral interviewing process. Hopefully this was informative and you at least have some information that you can go back and start looking at your recruiting process, your interviewing process, and hopefully this will allow you to have to make better hires in the future. So with that, we'll open it up for any questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. Yeah, I had a few questions that came through as you were speaking. So the first one is, how long should an interview be?
It's a good question. So typically if it's, on a panel interview, you might see it a little bit longer because you're kind of putting all the questions into one interview. So you might see a panel interview, maybe an hour and a half. A one-on-one interview, in my opinion, should not be much more than 45 minutes to an hour. So that's typical time frame process. It doesn't necessarily need to be that. Sometimes you might have a candidate come in and based on just the first couple questions that you asked that they're not a fit for the organization. I do not recommend going through and asking all the questions. If you know for sure that they're not a fit and they're not doing well in the interview, it's perfectly acceptable to cut it short.
Good to know.
It seems like this would be a good tool to evaluate hiring managers as well, because now you have objective things to look back on successful candidates and how they were interviewed and who interviewed them.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. Yep.
I do have another question that says, it seems like getting references after an interview is a challenge because so many companies don't want to give information. Do you have suggestions for getting better previous work history details?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And, in today's, legal world, it's very difficult to get references. Most candidates are going to give you professional references where they have already contacted that individual in the past and let them know, hey, I would like to use you as a reference, and they agree. Those are the references that you should be calling. If you just call the HR department of a company, typically they're going to give you date, salary, and position and no other information. So I always recommend asking for at least 3 professional references and checking at least 2 of them before making a hiring decision.
Very good. Well, that's all the questions that we have at this time. So thank you very much for taking the time out today, Jason and Chris and everyone who joined us. I think it was very informative. I'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar to your emails, so you can keep your eye out for that, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everyone.